Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the HCRN Research Fellows presentation. My name is Dr. Ebony Rose Wade-Njai, and I serve as the Associate Director for the Center for HBCU Research, Leadership, and Policy. Today, we are proud to highlight the work of our 2025 HBCU Center Research, Practitioner, and Graduate Student Fellows. Each fellow will present their current research projects, followed by an opportunity for questions and engagement from the audience. Please join me in welcoming Lennox Cowan, HBCU Center Graduate Fellow and PhD candidate in African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Ashley Brown Greer, HBCU Center Research Fellow and founder/CEO of International HBCU Exchange. Johnny Allen Jr., HBCU Center Graduate Fellow and doctoral candidate in the Higher Education Program at Florida State University. And finally, Arsene Frederick, HBCU Center Graduate Fellow and PhD candidate in the Higher Education, Leadership, and Policy Studies Program at Howard University. We would like to thank you, and we're honored to have you here to share your insight and contributions to HBCU Center scholarship and practice. Let's begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start my presentation, I want to acknowledge Ty Compton, a 2024 Howard University graduate who penned a letter in the 2023 edition of the Hilltop titled The Acceptance of Black Neurodiversity. His retelling of a story where a Black professor on campus used gross ableism to suggest that he should not stay in the course because of his autism was courageous and timely to address the spectrum of mundane instances of pedagogical performances at HBCUs. I take Ty's anecdote and use it as my inspiration here. My presentation titled In Living in Full Color, an exploration of the spectrum of Black teaching at HBCUs and visual media is a sampling of my larger dissertation project. Next slide. I use Brian Keith Alexander's definition of the teachable moment as the time and space in which the ignorance of one person can be informed by another. Next slide. And the conditions under which we live can be used to impart knowledge as well as to engage a critical dialogue. Using this term, I argue that fictional media depictions of teachable moments between Black faculty and students at fictional HBCUs exposes the gaps for future research on pedagogy at Black institutions. By examining teachable moments on A Different World at All-American Homecoming, I use textual analysis to explore the perpetuation of limiting polarized views of HBCU teaching to propose that cultural production in visual media highlights the complications with being a Black teacher in Black educational spaces while interacting with Black students. I also consult with Diana Taylor's scenario as paradigm setups that rely on live participants and structured around a schematic plot with an intended end. The HBCU in the classroom has a certain schema that we have come to know, but I ask, can we explore pedagogy in these spaces more to peel back the layers of how indelible an image the HBCU, an American educational institution, as a scenario really is? To some degree, fictional visual media gives a glimpse of the axiomatic understanding of what HBCUs are and how teaching looks in these spaces and within media. Next slide. I situate my work within two literary genealogies. First is HBCU teaching and learning more broadly. Scholars like Amanda Wilkerson found that HBCU educators utilize cultural relevance and politicized care to connect with their students. Steve Mobley and Crystal Williams found that HBCU educators use innovative ways to reach students at varying levels of proficiency. And Jennifer Burrell found that HBCU educators may be biased in their perceptions of students depending on different characteristics of Blackness. Next slide. The second genealogy I situate my work in is the scholarship on Black educators' portrayals in fictional media. The writing on Black men in the media is skewed compared to other populations, meaning from my observations, there needs to be more written about Black women teachers, Black queer teachers, Black disabled teachers, etc., in their portrayals in the media. Additionally, scholars like Dominic Quinney, Amir Gilmore, and Anthony Brown argue that Black male educators in fictional media have been seen as concerned for student success, but also imbecilic and apolitical. And Gloria Ladson-Billings argues that Black women educators in fictional media have been seen through the lenses of controlling images such as the mammy or sapphire, but should more accurately be viewed as warm demanders. Next slide. There have been countless pieces of media depicting life and learning at HBCUs, from School Days to Queen to Drumline, but I choose to focus on the shows A Different World and All-American Homecoming because they address over the course of multiple seasons a plethora of political discourse impacting Black students during their original airtimes. And they highlight instances of pedagogical interactions between Black students and Black teachers as nuanced performances. Next slide. In studying the pedagogical performances of various interactions between Black HBCU students and educators, I found three common portrayals. First, the teachable moments as tough love is used by educators to deploy deficit language to students by veiling it as honesty to get the best out of them. This is seen in A Different World with Dwayne Wayne suggesting that Lena James should not critique his teaching when she scored below the curve. Or when Dr. Pace in All-American Homecoming repeatedly reminded Keisha that she is not a good dancer and will not be successful in the program. Because of these interactions, we see students like Whitley Gilbert in A Different World, who after Dean Hughes tells her she is not a model student of Hillman, starts doubting herself and is ready to stop representing the school altogether. Or an All-American, after a series of beratements from Dr. Pace, Keisha struggles with crippling anxiety and doubts her ability to stay in the dance program. And in each case, the educator finds a way to repair the harm done by directly addressing where they went wrong. Dwayne Wayne told his students he would still have high expectations, but is going to attend to their learning needs. Dean Hughes spoke with Whitley again and actually told her she believes in her. And Dr. Pace apologized for her actions after recognizing the harm she was inflicting on her students was just her continuing the harm done to her. Next slide. The second common portrayal in both shows is that there are paradoxes Black women administrators must wrestle with during student demonstrations. Both series do well at highlighting Black women administrators as reoccurring or central characters. These fictional administrators are seen as empathizing with student efforts while having to adhere to the institution's demands within their job. In A Different World, students protest when Dean Hughes abruptly cuts off their radio show because she disapproves of the vulgar music they are playing. As students' occupation of the administration building goes into the wee hours of the morning, Dean Hughes and the faculty reminisce about their moments when they engaged in protest. And even after basking in her hindsight, Dean Hughes reiterates to the student protesters that they're trespassing in the building, and that is against university policy. Years later, in All-American Homecoming, President Patterson is conflicted when the women's tennis team plans a rally to speak up against police brutality and they call for the state's attorney general to investigate an incident when Georgia troopers harassed the tennis team on the way to a tennis match. President Patterson approves the rally and supports the students, but she also must remind students of the consequences set forth by the Board of Trustees if they continue the rally. While Black women administrators have a strong rapport with their students in both shows, there are major shifts in their portrayals over time. In A Different World, Dean Hughes does in fact reprimand Dwayne Wayne for playing the music and leading the student protest. She threatens the students to leave the building or be arrested. This mirrors, as Joshua Myers chronicles in We Are Worth Fighting For, the real-life protests, police interference, and sometimes federal law enforcement presence at student protests on HBCU campuses. However, in All-American Homecoming, President Patterson does not warn the students of the threat of the board, the threat the board makes, and lets them continue the rally as planned, because her goal is to protect her students. Her portrayal morphs from being concerned about the institution and building to ensuring that students know how to use their voices. Next slide. And last, the third common portrayal in both of these shows is a display of pedagogical genealogies. What I mean here, like intellectual genealogies, educators oftentimes come into their teaching practice by mirroring pedagogies they've seen or they experienced themselves from educators when they were students. In A Different World, we see Dwayne Wayne learn his tactics of tough love that he uses on his students from Colonel Taylor, a military man known as Dr. War on campus. Colonel Taylor uses intimidation to get through to his students in his mathematics classes. And it's these attributes that scare students away from taking their classes even when they're requirements. In some ways, Dwayne Wayne thought he could do the same thing, but that backfired. In All American Homecoming, we discovered that Dr. Pace, the dance teacher who has been treating Keisha unfairly, had a tumultuous past with her old dance professor. Dr. Pace's old dance professor even says to her, "I want to see how far you've fallen on yourself," indicating that the crass verbal and mental abuse Dr. Pace uses is a learned behavior. In both shows, we see origins of Black pedagogical practice within institutions steeped in whiteness. With Colonel Taylor being trained in the military, his harsh approach is rooted in training for combat war and advancing the American imperialist agenda. With Dr. Pace's dance professor, she is a white woman who is training a Black woman. There's a litany of educational research that highlights the harm white educators do to Black students in schooling spaces, namely due to the lack of care and cultural competence needed to engage with Black students as human beings. Both Wayne and Dr. Pace use these origins based in whiteness to construct Black pedagogical practices and performances to use with their students. These origin stories visually depict how pedagogy as an academic discipline needs to be interrogated more, because the mundane is often influenced by origins that were never meant to serve Black teachers or students in the first place. Lastly, in both series, the instructors learn from their mistakes and take accountability for their actions to confront their pedagogical origins. With Dwayne Wayne, Colonel Taylor reminds him that he used those techniques sometimes, but that does not mean he was not affirming or nice to his students, leading Dwayne to atone for his actions. And Keisha, who was fed up with the abuse, organized a seminar where Dr. Pace's past and present students were to speak on her harmful pedagogy. This and the impacts it had on their lives. But after seeing the sea of students who were ready to share their stories, Dr. Pace quickly reflects and decides to take a sabbatical from teaching dance to heal herself. Like fictional educators, Black educators must continue to examine their learned pedagogical behaviors and be ready to confront them so they do not continue harmful pedagogy with their students. In conclusion, fictional media can serve as a backdrop to continue charting the diverse, conflicted, and myriad forms Black pedagogies take shape at HBCUs. As a Howard alumnus myself, I had the best of my learning experiences at Howard from my professors, but there were imperfect moments too. My work does not suggest that we do away with the research on HBCU teaching that affirms the culturally responsive or caring practices, but more so urges us to think with the not so pretty moments to continue developing practices that are even safer for Black students. Regardless if HBCU students are learning the latest Black studies theories or protesting administrative actions, they should know that their humanity comes before any institutional or departmental goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lennox, for sharing your current research studies with us. While the audience is preparing if they have any inquiries or questions, please put them in the chat. What are your next steps for your research?
I want to continue draft or writing my dissertation. I'm actually presenting next month at the Critical Race Studies in Education Association conference. Some of my findings in visual media regarding Black pedagogy. So that's what I want to continue to do, is just presenting, but also starting to create some archives of what those depictions look like in media, creating some more lists and again some more archives.
I love that. And we at the center will always continue to support you. Thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, so we will go to Dr. Ashley Brown Greer.
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Ashley Brown Greer, and I'm a proud graduate of the Higher Education Leadership and Policy Studies program at Howard University. And my research is inspired by my experience as a Fulbright researcher in South Africa. And the study is, thank you. And the study is a comparative analysis of the influence of Christian missionaries on Black higher education in the United States and South Africa. Through my study of historically Black universities in South Africa, I noticed a striking parallel between HBCUs and HBUs in South Africa. Missionaries have played a significant role in establishing educational institutions globally, often linked to colonization. The goal of missionary work is to be of service to God, but intertwined in this system lies the oppression of people based on race, gender, and other intersecting identities. Colonialism involves the domination of people by foreign powers, with colonizers often viewing Christianity as superior to other religions. I'm going to give brief definitions of the sets of institutions. So the Higher Education Act of 1965 defines HBCUs as institutions founded before 1964 with the mission to educate Black people. In South Africa, historically Black universities, or historically disadvantaged universities, as they're known in South Africa, were designated by the apartheid government to educate Black, Indian, and colored people. And for our folks here in the US, colored people are what we would consider mixed or multiracial people. In this study, historically Black institutions will be used to define both HBCUs and HBUs in the US and South Africa. This comparative study seeks to understand the influence of missionary education for HBIs. This study will compare the similarities and differences and how the legacy of missionary education continues to impact these institutions today. The study will employ a document analysis as well as semi-structured interviews with higher education and theological experts. I have several research questions. The first, how did missionary education curricula influence economic and labor demands of Black people in the US and South Africa? How did the missionary curricula create and reproduce social hierarchies in the US and South Africa? What role did benevolent funding play in influencing institutional policies and academic curricula at HBIs? And in what ways have these historical factors continued to impact HBIs in the 21st century? This study employs Marxism and critical race theoretical frameworks to analyze the impact of Christian missionaries on HBIs. Marxism critiques capitalism's systemic inequalities, and alternative socioeconomic systems are explored as potential solutions. Critical race theory focuses on societal power structures to critique and challenge systemic racism. And for the sake of time, I will not give the definitions of all of the other categories. Next slide, I'm sorry. To evaluate the impact of Christian missionaries on Black higher education in the US and South Africa, one must consider historical segregation. South Africa's school segregation began as early as 1676. In contrast, the US had laws against educating enslaved people. The call to educate formerly enslaved people in the US began after the Civil War. Missionaries sought to educate Black students, often reinforcing socioeconomic divides. They indirectly influenced South African Black higher education as early K-12 schooling for Black students were established by missionaries. Missionaries played a role in establishing a significant number of HBCUs in the United States. Both face challenges, including, again, racial segregation and historical underfunding. Despite extensive literature on these sets of institutions in their respective countries, a comparative analysis examining the influence of Christian missionaries remains limited. It also indicates the need to examine how these historic systemic inequities continue in higher education today. Next slide. And for the sake of time, I'll skip this slide as well as the next slide and get to the similarities. So some of the similarities that I found just in my literature review, Christian missionary origins, again, both sets of institutions were founded or heavily influenced by Christian missionaries. Education was tied to religious conversion, moral reform, and civilizing missions. Curricula were shaped by Christian values like obedience, docility, and service, while our white counterparts were taught from the standpoint of power, and dominion. And again, a note, even though HBUs in South Africa were not established by missionaries, primary and secondary schooling, traditions of missionary influence carried over into higher ed. Early education between both sets of institutions prioritized industrial training and domestic service roles for women, often limiting their socioeconomic status to not compete with white counterparts on the job market. Also established within segregated or colonial power structures, which I talked about earlier. Both were responses to racial exclusion from white-dominated institutions, and they were not designed to challenge power, but to fit within it, preparing Black students for roles seen as socially acceptable. Marginalization and knowledge production and research. Neither type of institution was originally intended to be centers of knowledge, creation, or innovation. They were just supposed to be taught to go out, be a laborer, while predominantly white institutions were centers of knowledge. Which, when we're looking in the 21st century, few HBI or HBCUs in the context of the US hold prestigious Carnegie R1 and R2 status. Howard in 2025 just received R1 status. And then HBUs in South Africa are also underrepresented in the national research agenda. And then last, there's a lot more here, but last, student demographics. Both sets of institutions serve a significant number of predominantly Black students. In the case of South Africa, that would include Black students, Indian students, as well as colored students, with a significant population of first-generation and low-income student bodies. Next slide. And the differences. The historical context, HBCUs emerged after the Civil War during Reconstruction and segregation to provide education to formerly enslaved Africans. HBUs were designated under the apartheid policies in 1959, but many had colonial and missionary roots. And the apartheid state later co-opted these institutions to reinforce racial segregation under Bantu education. Institutional autonomy. Many HBCUs were controlled by white leadership until the 1950s. During this time, HBCUs maintained a level of autonomy, often governed by Black leadership. And then HBUs were tightly state-controlled with little freedom to choose curriculum or leadership, especially under apartheid surveillance. There is another similarity there. In both countries around the 1950s, there was a push for more Black leadership over these sets of institutions. And the next slide are my references. And then I thank you for attending the session and listening to my portion.
Thank you, Dr. Brown-Greer. I'm very familiar with you and your work. I wanted to, first, I think your comparative study between historically Black universities in South Africa and HBCUs in the US are simply fascinating. I wanted you to, you already acknowledged the striking parallels that you've identified in the Christian missionary influence and how it shaped the development, the identity. But I wanted you to, I don't see any questions, but I wanted you to speak about your company, International HBCU Exchange, and how it lends itself to your research studies.
Yes, so I am the founder and CEO of International HBCU Exchange, or IHBCUX for short. And the purpose of the organization is to increase HBCU student knowledge and awareness of federally funded international exchange programs. Again, my experience as a Fulbrighter in Malaysia is what led me to found this organization. But then as a Fulbrighter in South Africa, it really sparked something like, oh, wow, these sets of institutions should be working together to create this knowledge production. And so recently we were awarded a grant through the federal government, which has now been terminated, but the program is called HBIX, or Historically Black Institution Experience, with the goal of increasing research collaborations and partnerships between HBCUs here in the US and HBUs in South Africa, working with undergraduate students and faculty at HBCUs. We had 8 universities, 4 HBCUs and 4 HBUs in South Africa, focused on increasing research in the area of STEM, education, environmental sustainability, using a Pan-African and Indigenous knowledge theoretical framework. So definitely excited to keep this program going. Obviously, challenges arise, and so we're still working through that. But I think it would be an amazing opportunity for for both sets, HBIs, to really push forward, especially since from the research, it shows that we were never supposed to be producing knowledge and solving issues that affect us today.
That's perfect. And thank you for sharing. I'm just going to, we do have one question. How many HBU are in South Africa?
I'm counting them up now. Give me 1 second. I have it on.
Okay. Okay. I do want to encourage everyone to go to the lobby, or if you're looking at the panel, you can get in touch with all of the speakers that we've had for the conference, as well as the fellows, if you don't have immediate feedback currently. We are going to answer your question, Mr. Pratt. Dr. Brown, is going to verify that for you. And we're also going to turn over to Mr. Allen.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johnny Allen Jr. And yes, we go ahead and share. I have a little bit more of an intro on my slides. Thank you. Excuse me. As I mentioned, my name is Johnny Allen Jr., and I will be presenting on some current work that is ideally a work in progress at the moment. My presentation title is Embodying Afrofeminist Ideologies, Reimagining Black College Men's Gender and Leadership Identity Development. And next slide. So to provide an overview of my topic, just wanted to set the stage where we'll be heading with the presentation. I'll offer a brief positionality statement, highlighting my path to this work, and then also transition into talking about the background of the problem, highlight my research question, and some brief literature review, and then talk about why Afrofeminist ideology in Black men, and then offer insight into a qualitative data collection method, which is education journey mapping through an Afrofeminist lens. And then the last part is for question and answer. And then next slide, please. So yes, as I mentioned, my name is Johnny Allen Jr. I'm a doctoral candidate in the higher education program at Florida State University, where I serve as a graduate research assistant and instructor for the undergraduate certificate in leadership studies program, where I teach a number of undergraduate leadership courses. This semester, I'm currently teaching leadership and ethics, and I typically teach our Black male leadership course. And so the Black male leadership course has really contributed to my experience and knowledge when I think about my interest in this work, particularly exploring Black college men and their men and masculinity development. I'm also a cisgender man. I'm a son, a brother, an uncle, and a nephew. And I like to include that into my positionality because through the identities that I hold, I have been influenced by a lot of Black women in my life, particularly like my mother, my aunts, and then also my siblings and my cousins as well. And then I want to highlight my research interests to also name and how I entered into this work. So particularly thinking about Black college men and their leadership learning experiences, and then also Black college men and progressive Black masculinities and feminisms. ideally around historically Black colleges and universities, to particularly focus on the experiences of Black college men in predominantly Black spaces. Next slide. So just a brief background of the problem. And so gender and leadership studies within higher education context has consistently focused on three categories. So really talking about hegemonic experiences of masculinity or just dominant men identities that center the experiences of white men. There's also a focus on women in leadership experiences, but particularly white women, and not highlighting experiences of women of color and particularly Black women. And then there's this focus on toxic masculinity and machismo and men of color leadership experiences. So not always viewing masculinity in a positive light, but always focusing hyperly on the toxic masculinity and negative components of patriarchy and masculinity. And then most gender and leadership spaces are guided by socially constructed perceptions and beliefs that don't offer the opportunity for fluidity. So really thinking about how Black men come into the space in higher education and thinking about the way that their gender expression and embodiment takes form within college settings, and particularly thinking about the environment that they are in and how they navigate those spaces. And then there's limited research that explores Black college men's gender socialization and leadership learning experiences together. So really thinking about this relation to their embodiment and engagement of an Afrofeminist ideology and Black feminisms. I know a lot of folks have particularly probably heard about Black feminist thought and not so much about Afrofeminist ideology, which I will highlight as well in some future slides. Also, the basis of this work is really to reimagine the experiences of Black collegiate men as it relates to masculinity and leadership engagement. Ideally for them to make meaning with the intent to identify and understand how Black college men engage in leadership based on their interpretation and lived experiences with masculinity at historically Black colleges and universities. And next slide. And one more as well. So my research question is, in what ways can Black college men embody an Afrofeminist ideology in their gender and leadership identity development as a form of resistance to the constructed impulses of hegemonic masculinity? I know that research question really sounds like a lot. And so to break it down a little bit clearer, I really want to focus on the experiences of Black college men's gender expression embodiment through this lens of Afrofeminist ideology, which is a way of thinking and also connected to Black feminist thought. Ideally to challenge and resist the urges of hegemonic masculinity, or just more so namely dominant or toxic masculinity norms within higher education environments. And next slide. And so, Afrofeminist ideology. And so, to give a brief backstory, I learned about Afrofeminist ideology from a course that I took last spring throughout my doctoral program. I took a course called Black Feminist Thought and Rhetoric and Composition Studies in the English department, which led me to learn more about Afrofeminist ideology or Afrofeminist ways of thinking. And so within Afrofeminist ideology, developed and outlined by Jacqueline Royster in Traces of a Stream, written in 2000, Jacqueline Royster really highlights four components when thinking about adopting or embodying an Afrofeminist ideology. And so in Royster's work, really begins with talking about careful analysis. So ideally, this suggests typical concerns about scholarly behavior and really taking time to analyze scholarship with a critical and feminist approach, ideally with a clear accuracy and precision. So really being able to go back to the archives and thinking about how this work has developed over time and thinking about the originators of a lot of experiences that we focus on. And then secondly, there's an acknowledgement of passionate attachments. So it really reminds us that knowledge has sites and sources, and that we are better informed about the nature of a given knowledge base when we take account its basis of its origin. So really going back to the attachments and the origination of a lot of experiences, and namely we can go back to the experiences of Black women, African-American women within our country. And then next, there's this attention to ethical action. So really being able to think about this work and sense of accountability and being able to highlight the experiences of research and thinking about the experiences of lived people with an ethical action. So really being able to take the time to do this in an ethical way. So the sense of accountability there. And then lastly, there's this commitment to social responsibility. So knowing that knowledge has power to empower and disempower. So really thinking about the ways that we come to this work and thinking about Black college men's experiences in this aspect of a social responsibility as it relates to their gender development and embodiment. And next slide. And then, so I want to highlight a little bit of the literature review. With the background in lit review, really, as I mentioned before, gender and leadership studies in higher education and the different buckets that it focuses on. So really just thinking about all of those experiences of hegemonic experiences of cisgender white men, women in leadership, and then this toxic masculinity norms that surround men and masculinity's work. Additionally, also an Afrofeminist ideology. And so as Royster talks about, an Afrofeminist ideology is view doesn't just include Black women to build a community, but it takes into account the ways that everyone contributes to building inclusive and socially just communities. Also, Black feminist thought. So Black feminist thought challenges traditional notions of masculinity, particularly hegemonic masculinity, which often marginalizes and excludes Black men who do not conform to its narrow ideals. This includes exploring how stereotypes and expectations about Black masculinity impact their educational experiences, relationships, and identities. And then framing in this context of ethical Black men's feminism. So really thinking about a way for Black men to engage in Black feminisms or Afrofeminist ideologies and ways of thinking through an ethical lens. So really thinking about this way of adopting and embodying this particular way of expressing, but through an ethical lens to do that. And so really it's grounded in principles of justice, equity, and solidarity. So being able to go back to the origin point and really knowing the archival work of how we come to understand our identities, particularly as related to gender expression and gender embodiment. And then Black men's role and Black feminist criticism. And so Black men can challenge patriarchal norms and combat misogyny within their communities and broader society, as Michael Awkward really talks about this work as well, and thinking about ways that Black men can offer some criticism within Black feminist ways of thinking and knowing. Next slide. So why Afrofeminist ideology? Really because of the connections outlined here. So intersectionality, so really thinking about Black men's experiences as it includes all aspects of their identity and not just their race and gender, but thinking about the way of their sexual orientation or their class, et cetera, the way that the intersections of their identities also shape the way that they come to understand masculinity norms. Also, Afrofeminist ideology provides tools to challenge patriarchy. So really being able to deconstruct these traditional notions of masculinity and patriarchy as it limits Black men's understandings of themselves. And patriarchy is what is limiting a lot of us within US context, particularly around the way that we express and navigate the world. Also with centering Black women's voices and experiences, so really being able to go back to the origin of a lot of work, the acknowledgement and contributions of Black women in education, social movements, and leadership. And then this aspect of promoting equity and inclusion. So Black men's role in working towards creating environments that are inclusive and equitable of all intersections of Black men's identities. And then lastly, trying to connect this component of liberation and empowerment. So really being able to think about how Black men can challenge oppressive structures and systems while recognizing their own agency and creating positive change. And namely, this is connected to their exploration of their gender development. And so to highlight particular methods that I've focused on within my work or plan to do within my dissertation work is this component of education journey mapping. And so education journey mapping is a core aspect of my data collection tool as it offers the possibility for participants to visualize their experiences through a visualization. So how they make meaning of their experiences through an image that they particularly have drawn, so it could be pictures, symbols, or even words to really talk about their relationship with their masculinity development. And so ideally the prompt would focus on my participants, Black men in leadership spaces, and navigating and drawing out their journey through leadership as it relates to their gender identity development as well. And this visual representation, it provides a deeper connection to the lived experiences, stories, and narratives that they discuss. while also centering an Afrofeminist ideological lens to problematize hegemonic masculinity in leadership. So to really think about whether it's people or names of folks that the Black man participants might mention that ideally might be Black women or African American women in this context, to really focus on their gender socialization and their leadership development. And then lastly, just some reflections. Black college men should take opportunities to be in community with other Black men who are also willing to be vulnerable, support and challenge each other. This challenging of gender socialization is also tied to gender performance and expression that are deeply rooted in hegemonic masculinity. So really being able to come together and challenge these notions of traditional masculinity norms to hegemonic masculinity norms. As there is a direct connection to how it impacts leadership learning experiences and the ways in which Black college men engage in the leadership process. And then lastly, contributing to conduct more research about Black college men's engagement with progressive Black masculinities and Black feminisms to contribute to their gender and leadership identity development. And then researchers should also intentionally refrain from using deficit knowledge to discuss the experiences of marginalized individuals and promote more asset-based approaches. And that is all I have. My slides and my references, Q&A.
I just have to take a moment and say our HBCU Center Fellows are amazing. I'm so happy and proud of the work that's being produced. I do see some questions, but I do want to offer, Johnny, your presentation introduced powerful connections between Afrofeminist ideologies and the re-imaging of how we approach Black college male leadership development. I know that you do this work on a daily basis, and it's good that you are linking theory to practice. We'll go to our first question. I do see two, and I know that we have one more presentation. What impact do you think this research will have on how Black men engage with other Black male students from a recruitment and retention perspective within an HBCU environment?
Excuse me. Yes, that's a great question. And so for me, a lot of the times when I think about this work and I think about the progression of gender expression in the world, and particularly from like a Black man's point of view, I think that we're in this aspect of a lot of possibilities to really reimagine how Black men even come to express themselves. And for me, I think about this in the HBCU context that could be very pivotal to Black college men entering into the space when we're talking about, let's talk about Black fraternities, for example, and just thinking about a lot of the possibilities there to reimagine what it means to be a brother or a fraternity member in an organization. And so being able to approach this from an Afrofeminist lens or engaging with like Black feminisms to really get to this essence of vulnerability as a necessity to navigate leadership spaces. And so I'm hoping that the impact of this research will show and highlight ways that Black men can still be themselves in the spaces that they occupy through the lens of also uplifting individuals who might not embody the traditional notions of what masculinity is.
Thank you. And we'll have one more question. Do you envision a world where all three core identities can thrive?
Mm-hmm. I do. I think, and to answer this question, I go back to like my lived experiences. As a lot of time, I tell folks the way that I transitioned and learned about like Black feminisms or Afrofeminist type perspectives, I go back to thinking about my father. And so my dad really never put me into these boxes of what it means to be a man. However, my dad showed me more like progressive Black masculinities, as Muta talks about, Athena Muta talks about in her work. We're just talking about ways that vulnerability is a core aspect of who we are. And so for me, my dad always shown that from like a hug or a kiss on the forehead, or when we get off the phone today, like it's still the I love yous. And so for me, I believe there is a world that all three or aspects of our identity can be present. And so thinking about the ways that it can have a masculine embodiment or expression of my gender, while also having a Black feminist perspective or gender expression to the way that I show up in spaces. So I do believe there is a space to do that.
Thank you so much. Now we will have graduate student fellow Arsene Frederick.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be before you here today. My name is Arsene Frederick Jr., fourth-year doctoral student in the Higher Education Leadership and Policy Studies PhD program in the School of Ed. And today I will be presenting my presentation here entitled Understanding Policy Change for Public Historically Black Colleges and Universities, a Conceptual Analysis using the Advocacy Coalition Framework. So I want to get into the purpose of this study to orient ourselves for this presentation here today. So this study explores using the Advocacy Coalition Framework, which, by the way, I'll get into in just a moment, and think about how it could be used as a strategic tool to strengthen funding and affordability efforts for public HBCUs. Let's talk about the research questions here. We have two questions here, and really these questions sort of situate higher education funding as a state level priority, especially as it relates to HBCUs as a specific kind of policy. So in thinking about the different kinds of legislation as well as budgets that are being passed by state legislators, these questions really think about how state legislators are making college more affordable for public HBCUs, as we know that these state legislators are the ones who are setting the policy, along with many other agencies across the state for higher educational institutions. And so thinking about how these state legislators are making college more affordable for these institutions, but also the students that they serve, but then also thinking about, again, going back to that piece around the budgets at the state level, as well as different types of legislation and budgets, as well as different types of legislation, and thinking about the role of higher education funding, higher education finance. We've heard from the speakers earlier talk about this as a pressing issue, higher education finance for HBCUs across the US, but there are also other priorities which oftentimes compete against or compete in addition to funding, such as public safety, such as infrastructure and other areas, different types of partnerships that might arise out of that. And so to that end, how are state legislators really thinking about this particular topic for these specific institutions and the students that they serve? So I want to get into just a little bit of the literature here to, understand where is this study coming from, and what would that mean for where is this the concept for this study coming from, and what does that mean for the set of institutions and the students that they serve. And so Palmer and Young really talks about how HBCUs as institutions, so broadly public and private HBCUs, create an environment that is culturally affirming for students from Black African American backgrounds. We also know that HBCUs, as the speaker said earlier from the policy session, punch above their weight. And the UNCF does a lot of great work in really showcasing the ways in which HBCUs do more with less. We know that in 2017, it was about $14 billion in economic impact, and through their 2024 study, yes, it's about upwards of $16 billion in economic impact. So we're continuing to see these set of institutions not really having that many resources, but at the same time, really having an outsized impact, not only economically, but also in terms of graduating students from a low SES, Black African American students from a low SES into the workforce and ultimately into the middle class. And this is what Nathanson, Samoya, and Gasman tells us. And then finally, Koch and Swinton really just sort of ties all this together and thinking about how in many communities that are rural communities, how HBCUs are often, the only institutions that are serving as anchors in the community, as economic engines. And if these institutions if these institutions disappear, what would that ultimately mean for the economy? Some additional points I want to raise here is that we're here today at the HBCU conference, and so I reckon that many of you have heard about the increasing enrollment at HBCUs, and so we know that that's at about 9 to 10%. We also know that public HBCUs are institutions that are more sensitive to changes in in levels of support, governmental support from the government comparatively to private HBCUs that are different in terms of their governing structure, as well as them being a little bit more tuition dependent. And so when we think about the orientation for this study here today, we have a kind of a situation where colleges, the cost of colleges, it's really high. We also know that the types of students, Black African American students, as well as low-income students who are coming to HBCUs, they are depending on that aid that's coming from the state and the federal government. At the same time, these institutions have capacity challenges, they have capacity issues. And so this study is really thinking about a specific type of policy. How are state legislators thinking about this specific type of policy and using their influence to do good for these institutions? All right, let's talk a little bit about this conceptual framework. So really, Sabatier and Jenkins, this conceptual framework pulls from several fields. Three, just to name a few, three are political science, sociology, psychology, and really just sort of calls into question this this concept of policy, the policy process being in a very linear format, meaning that in a state legislature, a bill is introduced, it goes through committee, it hits the floor, both chambers of the state legislature pass the bill, the governor signs it, it comes into law. What Sabatier and Jenkins says is that policy change is not a linear process that just happens. It takes place over time. It is also values and beliefs informed, and in some cases, values and beliefs driven. And so when accomplishing policy wins, the process is iterative. And so this study really employs the advocacy coalition framework and applies it in the HBCU context to understand coalition building among policy actors as a means to advance college affordability. One thing to note about policy actors, for this study, I employed Gandara 2020 definition of policy actors to really think about this broadly. So some examples that Gandara lists for policy actors are state and federal officials across higher education, policy intermediary officials, and executive office representatives. And this enables us to think about who the stakeholders are, if you will, when it comes to public HBCUs as well as college affordability. But more importantly, thinking about how this policy ultimately could be advanced for the needs of public HBCUs. And so for this research, I focus specifically on state legislators because state legislators, they are key stakeholders that play a key role, a critical role in shaping the legislative landscape for higher education policy. All right, so let's get to some of the strategic applications for policy reform here. So in thinking about policy framing, we know that HBCUs are doing more with less. And we know that given that fact, HBCUs are continuing to have a substantial impact economically. We also know that HBCUs are graduating Black African American students in STEM and in STEM fields like none other. One particular example is Florida Agricultural Mechanical University, FAMU, who's doing a really great job of graduating Black African American students in the fields of engineering. And so in thinking about that, how can data, based upon the data that we have, based upon organizations like the UNCF and organizations like Here Today, we're here today at the HBCU conference, how could we utilize this data to push and advocate for specific types of policies that are advancing the interests of public HBCUs and frame them in ways that will essentially ensure that these policies are good. Secondly, policy windows. In thinking about policy windows, what are the opportunities, what avenues exist to push newer ideas or ideas that might be considered new in the legislative landscape or that might not have as much legitimacy as other ideas in the legislative landscape, and ultimately advance them. So when we think about windows, what kinds of political, social, or economic disruptions are happening to allow which opens up that window. One example is the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw local, state, and federal leaders open up all kinds of opportunities for funding, as well as lots of legislation was ultimately passed. And we've seen HBCU leaders essentially pursue those opportunities to advance the interests of their institutions as well as the populations that these institutions serve. And so what kinds of windows here? And then from the first bullet and the second bullet, what do we learn from in thinking about the data that we have available and thinking about the pursuit and having conversations with legislators? What are we learning throughout this process? And again, this framework talks about it as an iterative process, and so continually refining this approach. And then finally, the development of long-term cross-sector coalitions. What kinds of organizations or what kinds of groups are in the legislative arena or in the policy arena, and what are their concerns, what are their interests, and how does that align with, in this case, we talking about college affordability, how does that align with advancing the interests of college affordability for public HBCUs? So one model, one example to think about here is the Science and Chips Act. And in passing the Science and Chips Act, which focused on advancing a lot of research and development, scientific research and development initiatives, we've seen the growth and the development of the HBCU CHIPS network, which works across the public and private sector, as well as the philanthropic sector, to advance this particular interest. And so when thinking about cross-sector coalitions, is really an examination of what kinds of stakeholders, players are in the arena. And then finally, the implications for research and policy. And so in thinking about belief-centered, as it relates to legislators recognizing and understanding that values, identities, shared beliefs influence legislative priorities and long-term policy outcomes. The second point here, state legislators are part of coalitions. And so one thing to note here is that whenever a politician broadly, more importantly, a state legislator, let's say, for example, they're either newer or maybe they're running for a re-election, whenever that election is done and they then begin to get into the governance phase, they're placed on committees. They're placed on committees, whether it's the agricultural committee, the education committee, the finance committee, so on and so forth. And in those committees, they really make it a point to advance the interest that they really think is important. And sometimes actually a lot of times what happens is they work collectively, they work cohesively. The point that I'm saying here is they don't work independently, simply and only on a committee to advance a particular type of bill or to advance a particular type of legislation or a particular type of policy. So let's say if there's 12 individuals on the committee, or maybe 6 individuals on the committee, or maybe 9 individuals on a committee, in that they operate and work in coalitions or operate and work in groups. So there might be 12 individuals, but 6 or 7 support this particular legislation, or 6 or 7 oppose this particular legislation for whatever reason that will be. And then in that 6 or 7, sometimes there's sub coalitions in that. And this happens for a wide array of reasons. Maybe there's a technicality in the legislation. Maybe, unfortunately but truthfully, there might be a personal dispute, right? And so the point here is that state legislators, they are parts of coalitions that seek to advance specific interests. And then finally, long-term coalition building. How could you begin to think about, again, the stakeholders that are in the arena and begin to build with them as a coalition to continue to drive impact across research, policy, and practice? Thank you so much for coming to attend my presentation here today. I would like to now transition to discussion for question and answer.
Well, while we wait for question and answer, I really want to let you know, Arsene, your presentation offered a timely and strategic lens on the persistent funding challenges facing HBCUs. I really look forward to your work. I know it intimately. You come to the center often, and how it can inform more equitable legislation approaches to college affordability and the situation that we're in now, funding for HBCUs. I do see a question. Let's see. Okay, so we have Why frame specific policies as an improving of the economic welfare of HBCU body than highlighting its national impact? Let me see what the author is asking. Okay.
Okay. What we have here is why frame specific policies as improving of the economic specific policies. Yeah,
So
that's a really good question. I think broadly when it comes to HBCUs, a good amount of times, and organizations like UNCF and the Thurgood Marshall College Fund do a really great job at telling the story of HBCUs. So I cited, a couple of the top line points on the research side around the economic impact, around taking students from low income backgrounds and moving them into the middle class, as well as the impact that HBCUs have in specific fields in terms of Black African American students, being graduating. And so that's the first point here. As it relates to the ways in which HBCUs will orient themselves, there are different interests, whether it's state by state, whether it's institution by institution, whether it's institution type by institution type. So it really just depends on what is the set of agenda priorities that the leaders of that institution or that particular HBCU coalition will want to ultimately advance. But in taking a step back, this sort of topic around college affordability, as Dr. Wade mentioned, is timely in that many times we hear this sort of point around, well, HBCUs are more expensive than, for example, predominantly white institutions, when in fact, HBCUs are right on par in terms of tuition comparatively to their PWI counterparts. HBCUs are ultimately just under-resourced. They're just simply under-resourced institutions. And given the population that they serve, low-income Black students, these students that are coming to these institutions need the aid. And that's just the truth in terms of retention, in terms of graduation, in terms of student success. And unfortunately, from a capacity standpoint, we see some challenges there. And so overall, really just depends on the set of priorities that a particular HBCU or type of HBCU will want to advance. But as it relates to college affordability writ large, we see enrollment increasing. We see ourselves in an anti-DEI environment, et cetera. And so this is just one way to think about advancing, ensuring that Black African American students could continue to have access to higher education.
Thank you, Marcine. And thank you to our attendees for your questions. The HBCU Center will offer another opportunity for you to engage with the fellows that will be sent out through email. I want to encourage everyone to complete the session survey. Also at 2:30, our next session will be HBCUs in social justice, research, and policy. Thank you, everyone.